of the natural progressions when it comes to playing retro video games is to start collecting retro video games. After all, you gotta have something to play them, but when it comes to what you can collect, the sky's the limit. Games, consoles, controllers, CRTs, a poster of this in your bathroom. It's certainly possible to collect more than just what you need to play, and on the flip side, it's possible to play without having very much. Check out this guy with his Raspberry Pi. He's got everything he needs. Alright, so how does game collecting start? Well, it starts off innocently enough. You say to yourself, I'd like to have this particular console. So you buy that console. Then what good's a console without games? So you buy yourself a couple of games. Then if you have a couple of games, it's only reasonable you should have an entire room full of games that you could never possibly play all of, right? I mean, forget playing them at that point. What if you want to take a bath using video games and you can't do it? Okay, so maybe I skipped a step, but going from just a few games to an insane amount of games is really not too hard to believe. Most retro game collectors have two key things: disposable income and mad passion for games. Yeah, what else is gonna happen? Plus, most people don't really have much in their lives, if anything, telling them to stop. And if they do, it's nothing they couldn't just easily ignore. And don't look to the retro gaming community to stop you. If anything, we just encourage you to get more with all of our constant recommendations. This game's awesome, and this game's cool. Oh, and this game is great. This game is amazing. This is exactly why I constantly try to stress that sometimes less is more. I don't care how small or big somebody's collection is, I just want everybody to be happy. And maybe that makes me sound like a try-hard do-gooder, but sometimes it helps to just hear at least one person say, if you want to have a small or no collection, then I got your back, buddy. Of course, I'm not saying that having a collection is necessarily a bad thing either. These suckers bring some of us a lot of joy, and a big part of that is because we can use all of it. For me personally, I never want to collect anything that I won't play, but anything that I play, I do want to collect. It just doesn't feel right to me if I don't have some sort of physical representation of something in my collection that I can hold in my hands, stare at, and say, yeah, here it is. And I'm not alone in that. This is why a lot of people hate digital-only releases so much. When you own physical copies of your games, so long as you don't break the game or lose it, there's a certain comfort in knowing that you'll always have it. At the top of my list planning for the future is making sure I can play my Sega Genesis until the day I die. Plus, it's like taking a quick little stroll down memory lane every time you take a gander at those games before choosing one to play. Also, if you're somebody who wants to play on original hardware, then collecting the games individually is going to be a popular choice, although unsurprisingly not the only choice. You could always just get something like an EverDrive cartridge that can hold hundreds of games and make things a lot simpler. In fact, that's probably a good example that there's almost always shortcuts you can take if the goal is to simply play the game. And even if you are collecting games individually, there's still a range of options. You've got the cases, manuals, and artwork on top of just having the game itself. For cartridges in particular, it's not an uncommon way to go to just have the cartridge itself. I mean, you don't have to have the case and manual in order to play the game, but does that mean collecting the case and manual for a game should be considered superfluous and extra? I don't think so. Minimalism can be great, but you can always take things too far. Sure, a big plus for game collections is that they can be played, but it's within reason for them to look decent displayed as well. But how far should the display aesthetic of your collection be taken? Naturally, some collectors will take it farther than others, and this is where the collecting games dynamic can overtake the playing games dynamic. One day you could wake up and your game room looks like the inside of a claw machine game. One of the biggest assumptions that people make about collections is the more games you have, the better the collection is. I suppose for some people that's what they think, but the farther down that path you go, the more you increase your chances of having a collection of games that you'll never be able to play through. Collections can start looking more like a library, and when was the last time you heard somebody say, yeah, I finished my library? I do wonder if there's a bit of a collecting culture problem sometimes. I've seen game rooms forum tours before where the person apologized, that's right, apologized, for only having 30 games for one of his consoles. 30 games for one console seems like a lot to me. Most consoles I had growing up, I owned nowhere near 30 games for any of them, and I typically only had one console at a time. So how do people with such large collections justify them if they're unable to play everything in them? Simple, they just say they could play any of them. Throw it on the old backlog, the tried and true safeguard for games you may never play but can at least say you'd like to one day. Of course, a collector could also just be honest about the fact they'll never play all their games and be completely at peace with it, which I actually find to be respectable. But I just don't see that happening too often. Maybe some of us are naive, or maybe some of us are just optimistic. I'm telling you, once I get old enough and pass away, I'm not gonna have any more responsibilities, and hello, free time to play through all these games. Now, I've talked a lot about the impossibility of some people being able to play through their entire collection, but I think that simply having choice is what it comes down to for a lot of collectors. There's a comfort in knowing they'll always have the option to play a given game. You never know when the mood might hit. One magical day, the feeling could strike you and you think, all right, I can play that game. And that feeling alone for one game might be all it takes to justify dozens of other games you have sitting in your collection that you maybe haven't played for a while. But even with everything I've mentioned, I think what it really comes down to is that collecting becomes its own kind of joy independent of playing the games themselves. Games can take on a completely different meaning when it comes to collecting them. For example, games that are trash to actually play can suddenly become thrilling for some people to try to track down because of their rarity. Sure, the thrill of collecting games is often born out of a love for playing those games, but the collecting can become its own hobby where loving that particular game, at least loving playing it, is no longer the only thing that makes it appealing to you. I've seen people spend entire weekends just looking for games without ever spending a single minute playing any games during that same weekend. And yet, in a weird sort of way, wanting to play all these games can still be what's driving the desire to collect them. After all, I do still think most of the motivation for collecting games comes from the idea of wanting to play them, and even the stinkers just out of curiosity. You want to collect them so that in theory you can play them, but just perhaps aren't realistic about how much time you have to do so. It's like the old expression, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. If there's a game you think would be cool to play, it's hard for somebody to think that game looks cool, so I'm just gonna ignore it. Something else I feel I should bring up is that some people have games in their collection that they wouldn't necessarily be against getting rid of if it weren't for the hassle of getting rid of it. These games just sort of hang around because you bought it and played it once upon a time and never wanted to bother with the hassle of selling it. Some people just don't like selling things. I kind of respect that. You're not looking to make money off your old crap. Something I personally love to do. For example, I can't even tell you how many modern games I've purchased, played through once, and then sold almost immediately to try to get some of my money back on it because I know I'm never gonna play it again. Alright, but that about does it. Before I conclude here, I just want to say that hopefully nothing in this video makes anybody feel attacked. Ultimately, I just want everybody to enjoy their video game experience in whatever ratio of playing to collecting that might be. I thought this was an important topic to bring up because when it comes to adding games to your collection, there's a lot more encouragement than discouragement, and I constantly hear from a lot of you how you wish you could play your games more than you're able to. But with that, I'd love to hear from all of you about how you personally try to balance your collecting, or perhaps lack of collecting, with actually playing your games. I'm anticipating some pretty interesting answers for this one, so leave your comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes. And he hopes that you like what he had to say.